to prop up these cases. Call William Brown deference,
You put it under your pillow, you were 11 years old, and you were supposed to be asleep. The house was dark and your parents were in the living room watching television. You had the transistor radio 6 inches from your face with the volume turned so low you could barely hear it. But you could hear it. The Beatles were on, or the Tigers were in the ninth, or the DJ was about to play your song, and you lay there in the dark with the whole world coming through a speaker the size of a $50, and no one in that house knew you were still awake. Before we dive in, hit subscribe and drop a comment letting us know where you are watching from. Every kid in America in the early 1960s remembers the day they got their first transistor radio. It was Christmas morning, or your birthday, or you saved your allowance for 3 weeks, or your uncle gave you his old one because he bought a newer model. It was small enough to fit in your hand. It had a leather case or a plastic case, a wrist strap, a little dial on the side, and a single earphone jack. It ran on a 9-volt battery that lasted about a day if you played it loud. And it was the most important thing you had ever owned. Not because it was expensive, it was not expensive. By the mid-1960s, you could get one for $15. A kid who mowed lawns could buy one in 2 weekends. But it was the most important thing you had ever owned because it was the first thing that was yours. Not the family radio in the living room that your father controlled, not the family record player that your mother could hear from the kitchen, not the car radio that only played what your parents wanted. This was your radio, your station, your music, your world, and you could take it anywhere. The sound. You have to talk about the sound, because the sound of a transistor radio was like nothing else. It was tinny, it was mono, it was AM only, which meant static between stations and distant voices bleeding through from cities 1,000 miles away. The speaker was small, the bass was non-existent, and the treble was sharp and scratchy, and it was the most beautiful sound you had ever heard. Because through that tiny 2-inch speaker came the Beatles, the Supremes, the Rolling Stones, the Beach Boys, Sam Cooke, Roy Orbison, and every song that would define your generation came to you through a piece of technology that fit in the palm of your hand. The music industry knew this. Phil Spector built his wall of sound specifically to come through loud and clear on a transistor radio speaker. Motown mixed their records to sound perfect on that tinny little AM frequency. The entire sound of the 1960s was shaped by the limitations of a 2-inch speaker because the record companies knew that is how the kids were listening. Not on stereo systems, not on hi-fi equipment, on a transistor radio under a pillow in the dark. Under the pillow. This is the memory. This is the one that every single person who grew up in the 1960s shares. You were in bed, the lights were off, your parents thought you were asleep, and you had the radio under your pillow with the volume turned down to almost nothing. Your ear pressed against the pillowcase, and the music came through muffled and warm and private, and it was the first time in your life that you had a secret from your parents that felt good. Not a bad secret, not a guilty secret, just a private one. The DJ talking to you at 11:30 at night like you were the only person listening. The songs played one after another, and you waited for the one you loved. And when it came on, you closed your eyes and the bedroom disappeared and you were somewhere else entirely. You were in the music, you were in the dark, you were 11 years old, and the world was enormous and mysterious, and it all fit under your pillow. And every single night for years, you fell asleep to the sound of AM radio coming through a transistor speaker, and you did not know that you were participating in the first private listening experience in human history. You just knew you loved it. On the bike, You hung it from your handlebars. The wrist strap looped over the grip of your Stingray or your Chopper or whatever you were riding that summer, and the radio bounced against the chrome as you pedaled through the neighborhood. The sound was terrible. The wind took most of it. The static was constant, but you could hear enough. You could hear the DJ, you could hear the opening notes of the next song, and you rode with music for the first time in your life. Not sitting still in the living room, not trapped in the back seat of the car, moving, free. 12 years old on a bicycle with a transistor radio and the whole summer ahead of you, and the sun going down and the street lights about to come on, and the DJ saying that was number 4 this week, and here comes number 3. You rode faster because the song was good. You rode slower when it ended. You rode home when your mother called you in. And the radio came with you because it went everywhere you went. That was the whole point. It went with you. Nothing had ever gone with you before. At the beach, at the pool, in the backyard, on the porch steps after dinner when the air was warm and the crickets were starting and you sat with the radio on your knee, turning the dial slowly between stations looking for something worth hearing. Sometimes you found a station from far away. At night, the AM signals traveled further and you could pick up broadcasts from St. Louis or Chicago or sometimes cities you had never heard of. Ghost voices from the other side of the country coming through your little speaker like messages from another world. You sat on the porch in the dark and listened to a DJ in a city 700 miles away play a song you had never heard. And you felt for the first time that America was bigger than your town, and that there were people out there listening to the same sky and the same music, and you were connected to all of them through a device that cost $15 and ran on a 9-volt battery. The earphone! The single white earphone on a coiled wire. You plugged it into the jack on the side of the radio and put the earpiece in one ear, and the world split in two. One ear heard your mother in the kitchen, your brother in the hallway, and the dog on the porch. The other ear heard the Temptations. It was the first time in history that a human being could listen to music that nobody else in the room could hear. Before the transistor radio, there were no personal headphones for consumers. There were no earbuds. There was no private listening of any kind. The earphone that came with your transistor radio was the ancestor of the Walkman headphones, the iPod earbuds, and the AirPods in your ears right now. It started with a single white earpiece plugged into a 9-volt radio in 1963 and a kid who wanted to hear the Beatles without his parents telling him to turn it down. The revolution! You did not know it at the time, but the transistor radio changed everything. Before it existed, there was no such thing as personal music. All music was communal. The family gathered around the radio in the living room. The family sat together and listened to the record player. Music was something you shared whether you wanted to or not. The transistor radio broke that. For the first time, a 12-year-old could hear rock and roll without his parents in the room. For the first time, a teenager could listen to music her mother did not approve of. For the first time, the kids had their own soundtrack, separate from the adults, and rock and roll exploded because of it. The two things grew up together. AM Top 40 radio was designed for transistor radio listeners. Short songs, big hooks, catchy choruses, disc jockeys who talked fast and played the hits every 40 minutes. So no matter when you turned it on, you would hear your song within the hour. The entire culture of popular music in the 1960s was built around a device that fit in a shirt pocket. And when people say the 60s changed everything, they forget that the thing that made it possible was a $15 radio that a kid could carry in his hand. The shirt pocket. Here's a story you probably do not know. When Sony released the TR-63 in 1957, they called it the world's first pocket-sized transistor radio. There was just one problem. It did not actually fit in a standard shirt pocket. It was a little too wide. So Sony did something brilliant. They gave their salesmen custom-made shirts with slightly larger pockets. The salesman would walk into a store, slide the radio into their pocket, and say, "See, it fits right in your shirt pocket." The buyers believed it. The public believed it. The lie became the legend. And within a few years, the radios actually did get small enough to fit in a real pocket. Sony sold 7 million TR-63 units, and every one of them came with a promise that the future could fit in your hand. They were right. They were just a little early. What it cost. 3 things happened at the same time, and that is why the transistor radio conquered America. The first was the baby boom. There were more teenagers in the late 1950s and the early 1960s than at any point in American history. The second was prosperity. Families had money, kids had allowances, parents had disposable income for the first time in a generation. The third was the price. In 1957, the Sony TR-63 cost $40. By 1962, you could buy a transistor radio for $15. By the late 1960s, you could get one for $5. Radio Shacks sold their own brand called Realistic for less than $10. A kid could afford one, a grandmother could afford to give one. A family that could not afford much of anything could still afford a transistor radio for Christmas. And when you put those 3 things together, millions of teenagers plus money plus a cheap radio that plays rock and roll, you get a cultural revolution. Billions of transistor radios were sold worldwide. Billions. More than any electronic device in history until the cell phone. Waiting for your song. This was the ritual. You could not choose what played. You could not skip a song. You could not search for the one you wanted. You turned the radio on and you waited. And the waiting was the whole thing. Because when you wait for something, you want it more. When the DJ plays 3 songs you do not care about and then the opening notes of your song come through the speaker, you feel it in your chest. You feel it the way you cannot feel a song you chose from a menu and tapped with your thumb. The anticipation was the gift. You lay under the covers and the DJ said coming up after the break and you held your breath. Sometimes it was your song. And sometimes it was not. When it was, you turned the volume up just a tiny bit and closed your eyes and it was perfect. It was yours. You had earned it by waiting. And the next morning at school, you told your friend, "I heard it last night. Did you hear it?" And she said yes, and you both smiled because you had been lying in your separate beds, in your separate houses, listening to the same song at the same time on the same station, and you had not known it until that moment. That was the transistor radio. It was private and communal at the same time. You were alone with the music and connected to everyone who was listening. That does not exist anymore. The battery, the 9-volt battery. You bought it at the drugstore or the 5 and dime, or your father had one in the junk drawer in the kitchen. You snapped it onto the connector inside the battery compartment and the radio came to life. A 9-volt lasted about a day if you played it at normal volume, less if you played it loud. And you always knew when the battery was dying because the music slowed down and the DJ's voice got deeper and lower like he was falling asleep, and the static got thicker and the volume faded, and you turned the dial all the way up trying to squeeze the last few minutes out of it. Sometimes the battery died in the middle of your song, sometimes it died at the bottom of the 9th. And you lay there in the silence holding a dead radio, and the night felt emptier than it had ever felt before. You needed a new battery. You needed it now. But the store was closed, and your parents were asleep, and you had to wait until morning. You fell asleep in the silence. And the first thing you did when you woke up was ask your mother for a 9-volt battery. She said, "What happened to the last one?" You said it died. She gave you one from the kitchen drawer and you were back. The world came back through the speaker and everything was right again. 60 cents for a 9-volt battery. That was the price of the world. Then the music stopped. The Walkman came in 1979, and for the first time you could choose your own music instead of waiting for the DJ to play it. You could make a mixtape and carry it with you. The boombox came, and it was bigger and louder, and it had stereo, and the transistor radio suddenly sounded small and old. The Discman came, and the sound quality was better than anything AM radio could offer. The iPod came in 2001, and 1,000 songs fit in your pocket, and you never had to hear a commercial or a DJ or a song you did not want again. And then the iPhone came, and the radio and the music player and the telephone and the camera and the map and the newspaper all became one thing in your hand. And the transistor radio was not just obsolete, it was incomprehensible. Why would you carry a device that only does one thing when you have a device that does everything? Because a device that only does one thing does that one thing with your whole attention. You were not scrolling, you were not texting, you were not switching between apps. You were lying in the dark with your ear against the pillow, listening to a song, and that song had all of you. Every bit of your attention, every corner of your imagination. The transistor radio did not play music in the background of your life. It played music in the center of your life. And when was the last time anything played in the center of yours? The AM stations that played the Beatles and the Supremes in 1965 are gone now. Most of them play talk radio. The DJs who talk to you at midnight like you were the only person listening are gone. The 9-volt battery that lasted a day is gone. The leather case with the wrist strap is gone. The single white earphone is gone. The dial you turned slowly between stations looking for something worth hearing is gone. But the transistor radio is still in a drawer somewhere in your house. In the junk drawer, in the kitchen, or the nightstand in the guest room, or a box in the garage. And if you put a battery in it right now and turned the dial, you would probably still hear something. It would be staticky and faint, and it would not be the Beatles, but the sound would come through that tiny speaker the same way it came through 60 years ago, and for a second you would be 11 years old again, lying in the dark with the radio under your pillow and the whole world 6 inches from your face and nobody knowing you were still awake. And that is worth more than every song on every streaming service that has ever existed. If you put your transistor radio under your pillow, tell me what station you listen to. If you hung it from your handlebars, tell me what year. If you heard the Beatles for the first time through that tiny speaker, tell me which song it was. If you still have it in a drawer somewhere and you are thinking about going to check, go. I will be here when you get back.